Już puściłeś? O, zaczyna się.
Minuta 55.
Tak. Ja się spodziewam, że podadzą hardware, nie pokażą konsoli.
Czy może... Może pokażą wygląd, nie wiem.
Że render tylko, tak?
No render albo
Ewentualnie render pokażą. Nie pokażą żywej konsoli, ewentualnie będzie render. Dobra, mam już stream.
No to jest prezentacja, która miała być na Game Development Convent, czyli...
Tak, na GDC miała być, tak, dokładnie.
Czyli nie będzie poświęcona, nie będzie przygotowana pod graczy, tylko bardziej pod samych twórców gier, więc będą to raczej takie biznesowe rzeczy typu, no fajnie, będziemy mieć fajną architekturę, fajny procesor, fajną pamięć, w ogóle wszystko będzie dostępne od razu i wszystko będzie dostępne fajnie i szybko i będzie cudownie.
Chyba, że skroili tą konsolę, znaczy prezentację pod właśnie obecną sytuację, czyli Xbox wywalił nam tutaj wszystko, co miał i może się Sony chce odgryźć. Zobaczymy. No, dużo czasu nie zostało. Jest taki live komentarii, tak, pierwszy raz robimy taką formę, możecie obejrzeć z nami. Piszcie w komentarzach, czy to jest gumowe, czy to jednak coś fajnego.
Gumowe dno, co?
Gumowe dno, tak. Zobaczymy za chwilę, czy to jest wynik paniki Sony, gdyż no, przegrywa totalnie, jeżeli chodzi o marketing teraz. No, dobra. To teraz chwila,
Na którą wszyscy czekamy.
dla Sony.
Unfortunately, we had to cancel the talk that we had planned for GDC. But we do have some super exciting news about PS5. And
Widać po twarzy, że super exciting.
and the one and only Moxon.
Tak.
Without further ado,
Ciekawe, czy ci ludzie tam na tych są... Ciekawe, czy ci ludzie tam w tle są tacy prawdziwi, czy to rendery.
Today I want to talk a bit about our goals for the PlayStation 5 hardware and how they influenced the development of the console. I think you all know I'm a big believer in console generations.
Tak, pierwsze to też zrobiłem. O czym będę mówić? Legacy, history. Nasi fani przez wiele lat ufali nam i my nie zawiedziemy naszych fanów. Pamiętacie te wspaniałe chwile spędzone przy Crash Bandicoot przy PlayStation 1? Na PlayStation 5 też wydamy wam remake.
Gdzie mają pomysłów na nowe gry, ale nie powiemy wam tego.
For the PlayStation consoles, that period lasted through PlayStation 3, a powerful and groundbreaking console, but also one that caused quite a lot of heartache, as it was initially difficult to develop games for. So, starting
Wcale
with
nie czytam z
PlayStation 4,
promptera.
we've taken a different approach, roughly centered around three.
Co nie?
The first of these is listening
Słuchamy
to developers, which is
deweloperów.
to say that a lot of what we put into a console
No tak, w
derives
przypadku
directly
PlayStation
from
3 to
the
było
needs
problematyczne,
and
bo stworzyli najbardziej skomplikowaną konsolę, na którą
We
można tworzyć gry.
definitely do have some ideas of our own, but
Tak.
the core of our philosophy for designing consoles,
Nie bardzo słychać, co gadają. Możesz podbić trochę audio prezentacji?
which is to say that game creators matter.
Podgłoś tam.
Anything we can do to make life easier for the game creators or help
Nie
them
wiem.
realize their dreams.
Jest na maksa.
We will do. So, about once every 2 years, I take a
To w OBS-ie podbij audio z tego, z głośników.
Taki, że w OBS jesteś na tym samym. Chyba.
No, dajcie trochę dźwięku, pysie. Macie na myśli prezentację, czy...
Talking to well over 100 people at something like 24 publishers and developers. And it is
Problem polega
incredibly
na tym,
valuable.
że ja ci mam na tym samym dźwięku,
By the
więc
way,
może
the
teraz przyciszyć po
feature
prostu
most
Skype'a.
requested by the developers, that was an SSD, which we were very
No, nie
happy
to.
to put in the hardware, but a lot of problem solving was required. I'll be doing a deep dive on the SSD and surrounding systems later on in this
Powiedz teraz
talk.
coś.
It's also key
No,
to make
mówię.
a
Okej,
generational leap while keeping the console sufficiently
musicie
familiar
po
to
prostu
game
podgłośnić.
developers. I think about this in terms of balancing evolution and revolution. Now, with PlayStation 1,
ja
2,
siebie
and
trochę
3, the
przyciszę.
target was a revolution each time with a
No to
brand
nie
new
tak jak
feature
mówię, podgłoś po
set. That
prostu w
was great
OBS-ie
in a lot
cały
of
ten.
ways, but time for the developers to get up and running
Aha, okej.
got longer with each console. In the past, I've called this
Tego
time to
wystarczy dużo.
triangle. Here's what I had for those three consoles. To be clear, I'm not talking about time to make a game. Developers will be ambitious, and it may take
Prezentacja
them
jest tak
6
cicho.
years or so to
Serio,
realize their
oglądam
vision.
ją też na tym
What
i
I'm
jest po
talking
prostu
about
cicho.
is that dead time before graphics and other aspects of game development are up and running, and trying to minimize that.
Aha, teraz ani
On
nas
the
nie
other
słychać,
hand,
ani
if we're trying to
prezentacji.
reduce that dead time to zero,
O, lepiej,
that means
dziękuję.
the hardware
Proszę
architecture
bardzo, Marcin,
can't
dziękujemy
change at all,
za
or
info.
handcuffed.
Już
We
lepiej.
need to judge for each feature what value it adds and whether it's worth the
Dobra,
increase in
Seraf
development
będzie
time
mówił
needed
głośniej.
to support it.
Wcale nie.
So with PlayStation 4, we were able to strike a pretty good balance between performance and familiarity. We got required learning back to PlayStation 1 levels. With PS5, the GPU was definitely the area we felt the most tension between adding new features and keeping a familiar programming model. Ultimately, I think
Super,
it ended
nie,
up
ekstra.
under a month of getting up to speed.
Nawet
That
na,
feels like we're
nawet
striking
na
about
szkicu
the
tego
right
nie
balance.
zrobię,
I'll go into a
skurczybyki.
bit more detail later
Dobre są.
today about our philosophy with the GPU and the specific feature set
Teraz
that
będziemy
resulted.
słuchać
Och, teraz nowe
filozofii.
marzenia.
It's also very important for us
Znajdowanie
as the
nowych
hardware
snów,
team to find
marzeń.
new dreams, by which I mean something other than CPU
Dreams 2
performance,
potwierdzone.
GPU performance, and the amount of RAM. The
Dreams 2.
increase in graphics performance over the past 2
Tak
decades
jest.
has been astonishing, but there are other areas in which we can innovate and provide significant value to the game creators, and through them, the players. That's why the SSD was very much on our list of directions to explore, regardless of what came out of the conversations with game developers and publishers. The biggest feature in this category is the custom engine for audio. That's today's
Gość
final
wygląda jak Ragdoll z
The push
wyklejonymi
for
włosami.
vastly
Magia
improved
to
audio,
jest
and in particular 3D audio,
trójwymiarowy dźwięk.
isn't something that came out of
Największą
developer
nowością
meetings. It's
w
much more the
prezentacji
case that
PlayStation
we
5
had a
dużego
dream
gościa
of what
jest
might be
trójwymiarowy
possible
dźwięk.
5 years from now, and then worked out
Tak,
a number of
istniejący
steps
od chyba
to satisfy
99, czy tam
So here again
pierwszego
are the
Sound
three
Blaster Live.
principles. The first being enabling the desires of developers to drive the hardware design. To me, the SSD really is the
O
key to the
matko,
next
SSD.
generation.
Czekaj,
It's
tego nie
a
było.
game changer. And it was the number one
A,
ask
na
from
PC-tach
developers.
było.
Czy
for
każdy
PlayStation
posiada
5.
PlayStation 4
As
i
in,
przesiadł
we
się
know
na
it's
SSD
probably
ze swoim
impossible,
dyskiem?
but can you put an SSD in it? That was a discussion we were also having internally. It was clear that the presence of a hard drive in every
Half-Life 3
PlayStation
jeszcze
4
nie było
was
referencji,
having a
żeby zrobić z
positive
tego żart.
impact.
Sorry,
A
Marcin.
lot of things that would simply have been impossible at Blu-ray disc speeds were now possible. At the same time, though, in 2015 and 2016, when we were having these conversations, developers were already banging up against the limits of the hard drive. And a lot of developer time was being spent designing around slow load speeds. I want to focus in on just one number here, which is how long it takes to load a gigabyte of data from a hard drive. The difficulty being that hard drives are neither particularly fast nor flexible. If all your data is in one block, which is frankly not very likely, you can load 50 to 100 megabytes a second, depending on where the data is located on the hard drive. Let's assume it's on the outer edge, which means loading a gigabyte takes 10 seconds. If you compress your game packages, you can fit more data on the
Super.
Blu-ray disc and also effectively
Wiemy, jak
boost
działają
your
SSD.
hard drive read speed
Naprawdę.
by the compression
czekaj.
ratio. We support zlib decompression on PlayStation 4 that gets you something like 50% more data on the disk
Wszyscy fani
and
PlayStation
50%
4
higher
teraz,
effective
czy w
read
ogóle
speed.
PlayStation
Unfortunately,
patrzą
though, it's
na
highly
prezentację w
likely that your
PowerPoincie,
data is scattered
zastanawiają się,
around
do czego
in
doszło.
various files on the hard drive, as well as sourced from multiple
No, ogólnie
locations
na
within those
czacie,
files.
na live chat, na
lots
top
of
czacie i
seeks
live
are
czacie
needed, about
jest
2 to 50-ish milliseconds each. My
spam
rule of thumb is that the hard drive
boring.
is spending 2/3 of its time seeking, and only 1/3 of its time actually loading data. Putting all of that
Możesz
together,
pokazać
a
to,
gigabyte
Sara.
is very
Możesz na
roughly
chwilę zmniejszyć
20 seconds to
maksymalizację,
load
pokazać.
from a hard drive. Now,
innego chciałem
a
pokazać.
gigabyte is not much data. Games are using 5 or 6
Ten człowiek
gigabytes of
mówi
RAM on
w Melisie.
PlayStation 4, so
Po prostu
boot
spatrzcie
times
co
and
od razu
load
po nim.
times can get pretty grim. Or to put that differently, as a player, you wait for the game to boot, wait for the game to load, wait for the level to reload every time you die, and you wait for what is
Napisałem wczoraj takiego
euphemistically
newsa.
called fast travel. And all of that leads to the dream. What if we could have not just an SSD, but a blindingly fast SSD? If we could load
Zastanawiam się,
5
czy to trochę nie
gigabytes a
zaostra.
second from it, what would change? Now, SSDs are completely different from hard drives. They don't
Wydaje mi
have
się, że
seeks
wcale nie.
as such. If you have a 5 gigabyte a second SSD, you can read data from 1,000 different locations.
Chcieliśmy
in a
trochę
second.
komentarzy zrobić, ale
Przeczytam
sobie
wcześniej news.
As for
Zapewne więcej
time
będziemy
to load
słyszeć
a
o nowych
gigabyte,
grach czy
this is
funkcjach
next gen
ciekawych
we're
z naszego
talking
punktu
about. So
widzenia, o
memory is
featurach
bigger.
przydatnych przy
Instead, we should be
projektowaniu gier
asking
pod
how
nowe
long to load 2 gigabytes. And the answer
tak,
is about a
dokładnie.
quarter of a second.
Podoba mi
It's
się to w
amazing.
ogóle,
We're
jak
talking
w
two orders of
Gramagedonie
magnitude,
naprawdę
meaning
piszemy
very
i
roughly
trafiamy po prostu. To już jest
100
któryś raz z
times
rzędu, kiedy całe w ogóle
Which means
industry
with
się
5
jara
gigabit a second
totalnie.
for the SSD,
Wszyscy,
the
o tak,
potential is
zobaczymy,
that
zobaczymy,
the game
zobaczymy w
boots in a
Gramagedonie.
second.
No wiecie co, nie, to
There
chyba
are
o tym
no
nie
load
będzie i
speeds. The game
wychodzi
just
na nasze,
fades
nie?
down while loading a
Fakt,
half
może
dozen
nie mamy
gigabytes
tyle
and
klików,
fades
ale
back up.
przynajmniej
Same for
rzetelne.
a reload.
Efekty,
You're
jak
immediately
skrypty
back in
wywoje.
the action after you die. And fast
Nie wiem, ja
travel
pamiętam,
becomes
że
so
na
fast
pierwszym
it's
komputerze z
blinking missing.
Windowsem
As
98
game
miałem taki
creators, we
wygaszacz.
go from trying to distract the player from how long fast travel is taking, like those Spider-Man
Critical,
subway
right?
rides, to being
Right?
so blindingly
Right?
fast that we might even have to slow
Dobra,
that
nie zrobię
transition
tego,
down.
przepraszam.
Pretty
Więcej.
cool,
Pretty
right?
cool, right?
But for me, this is not the primary reason to change from a hard drive to an SSD. The primary reason for an ultra-fast SSD is that it gives the game designer freedom.
Wolność.
Or to put that
Daje
differently, with a
wolność.
hard
Dysk
drive,
SSD
the
daje
20
twórcom
seconds that
wolność.
it takes to load a gigabyte can sabotage the game that the developer
Ja lubię
is trying to
wolność.
create.
A
I think
ty lubisz
almost all of us
wolność?
in the
Ja
room
lubię
have experienced
szybkość.
this, maybe in different ways. Say we're making an adventure game and we have two rich environments where we each want enough textures and models to fill memory, which you can do as long as you have a long staircase or elevator ride or a windy
na Facebooku
corridor where you
przeklinać, nie?
can ditch the old assets and then take 30 seconds or so
Znaczy
to
to
load
w
the
ostatnim
UI.
streamie trochę się sypało
Having a
i nie
30-second
dostaliśmy jeszcze
elevator
bana, ale
ride is a
polecam nie
little
ryzykować.
more realistically,
Szukaj
we probably
zamienników
chop
słownych.
the world into a number of smaller pieces and then do some calculations with sight lines and run speeds like we did for Haven City when we were making Jack 2. The game is 20 years old, but not much has changed since then. All those twisty passages are
Wiele
there
się nie
for a reason.
zmieniło w ciągu
There's a whole
ostatnich 20
subset
lat.
of level design dedicated to this sort of work, but still, it's a giant distraction for a team that just wants to make their game. So when I talked about the dream of an SSD, part of the reason for that 5 gigabyte a second target was to eliminate loads, but also part of the reason for that target was streaming. As in, what if the SSD is so fast that
Ten
as
też
the
napadem
player
śmieszna
is turning
rekolekcja.
around, it's possible to load textures for everything
Mówię, on
behind the
mówi
player
w
in
języku
that space.
melisy i środków
If you figure that
uspokajających.
it takes half a second to turn,
W każdym
that's
razie
4
to, co on
gigabytes of
pokazał,
compressed data you can
to
load.
taka wrzuta
That
ode mnie.
sounds
Pamiętam,
about
że
right
kiedyś
for next.
oglądałem albo czytałem
Back
artykuł,
to the hard drive. Another
czytałem
strategy
artykuł
for
chyba
increasing
w
effective
CDA,
read speed is to make big sequential chunks of data.
że,
For example, we might
że
group all the
bardzo
data
podobną
together for
technologię
each single block.
wykorzystywały
That removes most of the
gry,
seeds,
które wyglądały
and
jak
the
Doom
streaming
3,
gets faster.
a
But there's a
mieściły się na
downside too,
dyskietce, że
which is that
doczytywało
frequently
te
used
tekstury,
data is
znajdowałeś
included
tylko
in many
projekty
chunks and
i w
therefore
miarę
is
jak
on the hard
oglądałeś,
drive many
kierowałeś
times.
postacią na dany punkt,
Marvel's
to się dopiero
Spider-Man
wtedy
uses
one
this
renderowały
strategy, and though it
jednocześnie.
works very well for
Czyli
increasing
używają
streaming
rozwiązania sprzed 10 lat tak
There's a
naprawdę dopiero.
massive duplication as a result. Some of the objects like mailboxes
Była
or
taka gra
news racks
Krieger
are
czy
on the
coś
hard
takiego.
drive
Zajmowała
400
64
times.
kilobajty.
What I'm
Też
describing
po
here
prostu
are things
renderowała
that
się
cramp
matematycznymi
a
wzorami.
creative director's style. Either level design gets
A nie
eliminated
64
in multiple
megabajty?
places, or the data is duplicated
mniej
so
niż
many
zrobiony
times that it no
screen z
longer
tej gry.
fits on the Blu-ray disc. And you end up with hard limits on the player's run speed or driving
Podobały mi
speed.
się
The
nasze
player can't
komentarze.
go faster than the load speed.
Język instrukcji bezpieczeństwa w samolocie. No
And
tak.
finally, I'm sure many of you have
Jeszcze ta
noticed that after a
gestykulacja.
patch download, a PlayStation 4 will sometimes take
Okay,
a long time
boomer.
to install the patch. That's because
Okay,
when just
boomer.
part of a file has been changed, the new data can be downloaded pretty quickly. But before the game boots up, a brand new file has to be constructed that includes the changes.
O!
Otherwise, every change would add a seek or two. Even so, you can occasionally see this
Spokojnie
happening
jak
on game
czubówna.
titles. They
Ten
start
głos
to
mnie
patch once they
łaskocze
get patched enough.
w wrażliwe
With an
części.
SSD, no seeks.
Tak się
So
czuję teraz.
no need to make brand new files with the changes incorporated into them, which
Nie widzę
means
cię,
no
więc sorry.
installs as you know them today. There's yet one more benefit, which is that system
Masuję
memory
mój
can be
mózg.
used much more efficiently. On PlayStation 4, game data on the hard drive feels very distant and
Ja
difficult to
powiem
use.
szczerze, że czuję się
By the time you
odstresowany
realize you need a piece
troszeczkę.
of data, it's much too late to go out and load it. So system memory has to contain
Ja
all
mam
of the
genialny
data that
pomysł.
can be
Jeżeli mnie
used
ktoś
in the
z
next
PlayStation,
30
z Sony
seconds or
ogląda,
so of
albo
gameplay.
obejrzy ten materiał
That means
gdziekolwiek,
a lot of the 8
wynajmijcie tej
gigabytes
gościa,
of
żeby
system
przeczytał
memory
całą
is
instrukcję obsługi
idle. It's just waiting
sprzętu i
there
wydajcie ją
to
jako
be
audiobook dla ludzi, którzy
potentially used.
mają problemy ze
On
snem.
PlayStation 5, though, the SSD is very close to being like more RAM. Typically, it's fast enough that when you realize you need a piece of data, you can just load it from the
Sony wchodzi
SSD
na
and
rynek
use it.
środków
There's
uspokajających.
no need to have lots of data parked in system memory waiting to potentially be used. A different way of saying that is that most of RAM is working on the game's behalf. This is one of the reasons that 16 gigabytes of
16
GDDR6
GDDR6
feels
w
right
końcu
for
jakaś
PlayStation 5. The presence of the SSD
informacja.
reduces the need
Tyle
for
co,
a massive
tyle co Xbox w
intergenerational
zasadzie.
increase
Tak, przy czym
in
w
size.
Xboxie mamy 10
So,
GB
back to the
szybszego
dream of
RAMu
the
i
SSD.
6 GB
Here's the
wolniejszego
seven
RAMu.
targets.
Z jakiegoś
Boot the
powodu.
game in a second.
Kto już się,
No
kto
load
już się dokopał do
Nie, oni
tego?
to podali sami.
Design freedom, meaning no twisty passages or long
mają-
corridors.
Okej.
Chyba 10
More
GB
game on
z
the
prędkością
disk and more game
70
on the
GB
SSD.
na sekundę
And
i 6
finally,
GB z
those
prędkością
patch
42 GB na
installs
sekundę.
go
Jakoś
away.
tak.
The reality,
To jest
though,
możliwe,
is that SSD is just one
możliwe,
piece
że
of
to
the
jest
puzzle.
na,
There's a lot
ta
of
część
places where
dedykowana
bottlenecks
jest
can occur in
tylko i
between
wyłącznie
the
powiedzmy na
SSD
grafikę.
and the game
Ona jest
code
szybsza
that
albo
uses the
wolniejsza,
data.
zależy
You can see this on
co oni
PlayStation
tam, na
4.
co
If I
potrzebują.
use
Tak.
an SSD with 10
Już chyba było
times the
pokazane
speed of a
przy
standard
premierach
hard
tej
drive,
karty
I
graficznej
probably
Wegi, że
see only
prędkość
double
RAMu
the
jednak
loads,
nie ma aż takiego
if
znaczenia.
that.
Bo
For
HDMI były
PlayStation
znacznie
5,
bardziej
our goal
przepustowe
was
przecież.
not just that the SSD
Możliwe, że
itself
ta
be
wolniejsza
100
pamięć
times
jest po prostu
faster.
na użyte
It was
karty
that
graficznej.
game loads and streams
To by
100
miało
razy
sens.
szybciej.
100 times faster. So every
Wszystko
single
100
piece
razy
of bottleneck needs to
szybciej.
be addressed. And there are a lot
O,
of them.
nic to nam nie mówi.
Let's look at check-in.
Znaczy
What
mówi,
happens
ale
when
no-
its
Normalny
overhead
gracz
gets
może w tym momencie
100 times
pomyśleć,
Wiemy to.
dzisiaj gramy w 60
Conceptually,
klatkach na
check-in is
sekundę.
a pretty simple process. Data is
6000
loaded into
klatek
system
na
memory from the hard
sekundę.
drive or SSD. It's examined.
Czekaj,
A few values are
60
tweaked
klatek
to
to nie
check
jest
it in,
jedna
and then it's
godzinos
moved to the
klatka,
final
czy jakoś
location.
tak?
Kilowatoklatki.
At the SSD speeds we're talking about, that last part,
Kilowatoklatki.
moving the data, meaning copying it from one location to another, takes roughly an entire next-gen CPU core. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If all the overheads get 100 times larger, that will cripple the frame rate as soon as the
Powiem
player
szczerze, to
moves,
trochę-
and a massive stream of
Tak
data
już
starts coming
troszeczkę,
off the
troszeczkę
SSD. So to solve all
się
of that, we
cofnę
built a
wspomnieniami.
lot of custom hardware, namely a custom flash controller and a number of
To jest
custom units
7-8
in
lat temu,
automation.
jak pokazywano
The flash
Xboxa
controller in the
i
SSD was
PlayStation,
designed for smooth and
to wyglądało to
bottleneck-free
kompletnie
operation, but
odwrotnie,
also
że
with
to, co
games
robił
involved.
wtedy
For example,
Xbox, to
there
chyba
are
teraz
6
robi właśnie
levels of
Sony,
priority when reading
czyli
from the
robi
SSD.
nudne, nikomu
Priority is
niepotrzebne
very
prezentacje,
important.
których
You can
nikt tak
imagine
naprawdę
the
nie chce i
player
nie
heading
potrzebuje,
into
a
some
Xbox
new location in the world
przyrównuje
and the
swoją
game
konsolę do
requesting
banana i
a few
lodówki.
gigabytes of textures. And while
Co,
those
co
textures
się
are being
stało?
loaded,
Dlaczego?
an enemy is shot
To są
and has
cienie
to
z Let's
speak a
Dance.
few dying words. Having multiple priority levels lets the audio for those dying words get loaded immediately. On one side, that flash controller connects to the actual flash dies that supply the storage. To reach our bandwidth
quick
target
math,
of 5
Aga, quick
gigabytes a
math.
second, we ended up with a 12-channel
2
interface.
plus 2 is
8
4.
channels wouldn't be enough.
Nie crow.
The
crow.
resulting bandwidth we have achieved is actually 5.5 gigabytes a second.
Sekunda,
With
bo
a
mi się jakiś
12-channel
kabel odpiął.
interface, the most natural size that emerges for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add
Zastanawiam się,
more,
czy nie
but Flash
zostawić
certainly
hostowania
doesn't come
Blachajowi.
cheap. And we have a responsibility to
Tego
our
streamu.
gaming audience to be cost effective with regards to what we put in the console. Ultimately, we resolved this question by looking at the play patterns of a broad range of gamers. We examined the specific games that they were playing over the course of a weekend,
Zrobię jedną
a week,
rzecz.
or a month, and whether that
Kliknę
set of
F5.
games would fit properly on the SSD. We were able to establish that the friction caused by reinstalls or redownloads would be quite low, and so we locked
No,
in
Aga,
on
masz
that
rację, jak najbardziej.
825 gigabyte size, while also preparing multiple strategies so that
F5 i
those
zobacz,
who
jak
want
się
more
like to
storage
dislike
can
rate
add it.
zmienił.
I'll go through the details in a moment.
Okej, jest
Back to the flash
prawie
controller.
7000
On the
już
other
na
side, connects to our main
dislike
custom chip
do
via
90
4 lanes of
000
Gen
lajków.
4 PCIe. And inside
Zobaczymy, jak
the
to
main
się zmieni
custom
pod
chip
koniec
is
tej
a pretty
prezentacji.
hefty unit dedicated to I/O.
A ile ty
Before
miałeś?
we talk about what that
Czekaj,
does,
przezroczystości
let's talk
tego
compression
programu.
for a moment. PlayStation 4 used zlib as its compression format. We decided to use it again on PlayStation 5, but on my 2017 tour of developers, I learned about a new format called Kraken from Rad Game Tools. It's like zlib's smarter cousin. Similar types of algorithms, but about 10% better compression, which is pretty big. That means 10% more game on the UHD Blu-ray disc or
Te
on
cienie to
the
są jak
SSD.
publiczność w
Kraken
FIFA,
had only been out for
dwuwymiarowa.
a year, but it was already becoming a de facto industry standard. Half of the teams I talked to were
Seraf,
either
to
using it or getting ready to evaluate.
Podglądam
So we
tą
hustled and
transmisję
built a custom
i dopiero
decompressor
zobaczyłem
into
tych
the
ludów
I/O
z
unit,
Ledzensat,
one
których tam
capable of
kleiłeś.
handling over 5 gigabytes of Kraken format input data a second.
Piękne.
After decompression, that typically becomes 8 or 9 gigabytes, but the unit itself is capable of outputting as much as 22
Kraken
gigabytes a second
format!
if the data happens to
Kraken
compress
format.
particularly well. By the way, in terms of performance, that custom decompressor equates to 9 of our Zen 2 cores. That's what it would take to decompress the Kraken stream with a conventional CPU. There's a lot more in the custom I/O unit, including a dedicated DMA controller. The game can direct exactly where it wants to send the
Super.
data coming off of the SSD. This equates to another Zen 2 core or two in terms of its copy performance. Its primary purpose is to remove check-in as a bottleneck.
Myślę, że pokazali
There's
za
two
mało
dedicated I/O
schematów.
coprocessors and a large RAM
Myślę,
pool.
że jeszcze z
These
5
aren't
się
Zen
przyda,
2
tak.
cores. They're there principally to direct the variety of custom hardware around them.
Usunąłem twoje
One of the coprocessors is dedicated to SSD I/O. This lets us bypass traditional file I/O and its bottlenecks when reading from the SSD. The other is responsible for memory mapping, which I know doesn't sound like anything related to the SSD, but a lot of developers map and
Uczcie się.
remap memory
Uczcie
as
się, a
part
będziecie
of
niedługo
file
projektować
I/O,
gry.
and this too can
Programować
become
na
a
PlayStation
bottleneck.
Tak.
5.
There are coherency
Silniki
engines
Patrzcie, jakie to
koherencji.
proste.
coprocessors. Coherency comes up a lot in
Koherencja
places.
pojawia
Tak,
się
dwa
w wielu-
procesory
The biggest
wyjścia,
coherency
wejścia.
issue is stale data
SRAM.
in GPU caches. Flushing all of the
Dobrze wiedzieć.
GPU
Jest
caches
SRAM.
wherever the SSD is read is
Robimy
an
to.
unattractive option. It could really hurt the GPU performance. So we've implemented a gentler way of doing things, where the coherency
tego gościa,
engines
bo ja mam
inform
tutaj-
the GPU of the overwritten address
Rośnie
ranges,
napięcie, rośnie
and
napięcie.
custom scrubbers in several dozen GPU caches do pinpoint evictions of just those address ranges.
Jest!
The best thing is, as a game developer, when you read from the SSD, you don't need to know any of this. You don't
Cześć,
even need to
cieszymy
know
się
if
z
your
cache'a
data
teraz?
is compressed. You just
O, jest gość.
indicate what data you'd like to read from
Jakieś
the
laga mam.
original uncompressed file and where you'd like to put it, and the whole process of loading it happens invisibly to you and at very high speed. Back to the dream. Thanks to all of that surrounding hardware, our 5.5 gigabytes a second really should translate into something like 100 times faster I/O than PS4, and allow the dream of no load screens and super fast streaming to become a reality. Having said that, expandability of our SSD is going to be quite important. Flash is costly, and you may very well want to add storage to whatever we put in the console. Now, the kind of storage you need depends on how you're going to use it. If you have an extensive PlayStation 4 library and you'd like to take advantage of backwards compatibility to play those games on PlayStation 5, then a large external hard drive is ideal. You can leave your games on the hard drive and play them directly from there, thus saving the
tutaj
pricier
Sony nie ma
SSD
czegoś
storage
takiego
for
jak
PlayStation 5 titles.
Xbox,
Or you can
że ma
copy your
external
active
SSD-ka,
PlayStation 4 titles to the
który
SSD.
dorównuje prędkością
If your purpose in
SSD-kowi
adding more
budowanemu.
storage is to play PlayStation
A
5
wow, to
titles
będzie
now,
bolało, powiem
ideally
szczerze, od
you
strony
would add to your
marketingowej.
SSD storage. We will be supporting certain M2
Trudno mi
SSDs.
się skupić
These
przez
are
ten tłum.
internal drives that you can get on the open market and install in a bay in the PlayStation 5. As for which ones we support,
Mam nadzieję, że to
when,
zrobi
I'll
furorę.
get to that in a moment. They connect through the custom I/O unit just like our SSD does. So they can take full advantage of the decompression, I/O coprocessors, and all the other features I was talking about. Here's the catch though. That commercial drive has to be at least as fast as ours. Games that rely on the speed of our SSD need to work flawlessly with any M2 drive. When I gave the Wired interview last year,
5,5
I said that
GB
the
na sekundę.
PlayStation
Dobrze
5
pamiętam,
SSD
na
was
Xboxie miał
faster
być
than
5 GB
anything
na
available
sekundę.
on PC. At the time, commercial
Tak,
M2
to też
drives
dali
used PCIe 3.0
przecinek
and
więcej.
4 lanes of that cap out at 3.5 gigabytes a
Nie
second.
mówiąc, że i tak
In
nie
other
wykorzysta
words,
5,5
no
GB na sekundę
PCIe
chyba na tej
3.0
konsoli.
drive can hit the required spec. M2 drives with PCIe
Znaczy nawet
4.0
jeśli
are now
wykorzystają
out
to
on
w
the
PC
market.
tak jest
We're
to
getting our in
standard od...
samples and seeing
Ja na
Ojejka,
przykład nie mam
4 or
momentu,
5 gigabytes a second from them. By
4
year's
klaw.
end, I expect there will be drives that saturate 4.0 and support
No
7
ale gniazdo na
gigabytes a
pewno
second.
masz, tak? I
Having said that, we are
na
comparing
płycie
apples
głównej.
and oranges
Nawet ja mam u
because
siebie, więc...
that commercial M2 drive will have its own architecture, its own flash controller, and so on. For example, the NVMe specification lays out a priority scheme for requests that the M2 drives can use. And that scheme is
Czyli,
pretty
jeżeli dobrze
nice,
rozumiem,
but
będziesz mógł
it
sobie
only
dorzucić
has
własną,
2 true
własny
priority
mnożnik.
levels. Our drive
SSD.
support 6. We can hook up a drive with only 2
No to
priority
wygląda.
levels, definitely, but our custom I/O unit has to arbitrate the extra priorities rather than the M2 drive's flash controller, and so the M2 drive needs a little extra speed to take care of issues arising from the different approach. That commercial drive also needs to physically fit inside of the bay we created in PlayStation 5 for M2 drives. Unlike internal hard drives,
Pokaż
there's
obudowę.
unfortunately no standard for the height of an M2 drive, and some M2 drives have giant heat sinks. In fact, some of them even have their own fans. Right now, we're getting M2 drive samples and benchmarking them in various ways. When games hit beta as they get ready for the PlayStation 5 launch at year end, we'll also be doing some compatibility testing to
Pierwszy
make
raz
sure that
powiedział
the
PlayStation
architecture of
Games
particular M2 drives isn't too foreign
Tak.
for the games to
po
handle.
25 minutach.
Once we've done that
Powiedział też-
compatibility testing, we should be able to
Powiedział
start
też,
letting
że
you know
nie
which drives will
mają
physically
jeszcze
fit
wersji beta
and which
gier.
drive samples have benchmarked appropriately high in our
Gdzie
testing.
Microsoft
It
wczoraj
would be
pokazał
great
już,
if that
jak
happened by
działają
launch, but it's
ten...
likely to be a bit past it. So
jak
please
działają nowe
hold off
Gearsy
on
i
getting
tą
that
drugą grę
M2
pokazali,
drive
tylko nie wiem
until
jaką.
you hear from us. Okay, back to our principles. Balancing evolution and revolution is
Skończyliśmy
the second
już.
of them. This was
A nie, skończyliśmy
definitely
pierwszą
a
część.
recurring theme with the GPU.
Jeszcze dwie.
Balansowanie
need
między
new
Musimy jakoś to...
rewolucją a ewolucją.
If we only have more performance, it's not really a new generation of console. Of course, many of these capabilities result in more performance. That's part of why a PlayStation 5 teraflop is more powerful than a PlayStation
Każdy
4
czeka na
teraflop.
obudowę. Mamy
O,
nadzieję, że
o,
będzie
o,
w...
Performance. We also need the
PlayStation
ability
5 ma
to do
więcej
something with the
teraflopów
GPU
niż
that could not
PlayStation
have been
4.
done before. And we
Super.
need higher performance per watt. Every time we double the performance of some GPU
Kapitan
component, we
Relanium.
don't want to find out we've doubled the power consumed and the heat produced. But at the same time, we have to make sure the GPU can run PS4 games, and we have to ensure that the architecture is easy for the
O,
developers
czekaj,
to
zapomniałem o
adopt.
tłumie.
Now, backwards compatibility was
Co
handled
zapomniałeś?
masterfully by AMD.
Muszę włączyć
They
tłum.
treated it as a key need throughout the design
A.
process. As our solution to adding new
No
features
ludzie
without
rozeszli się,
blindsiding
pomyśleli, że jest przerwa.
we made sure that if there were new significant features, it would be optional to use them. The GPU supports ray tracing, but you don't have to use ray tracing to make your game. The GPU supports primitive shaders, but you can release your first game on PlayStation 5 without making any use of them. Before I get into the capabilities of the GPU, I'd like to make clear 2 points that can be quite confusing. First, we have a custom AMD GPU based on their
Okej, mają tą
RDNA2
samą kartę
technology.
graficzną
What
co
does that mean?
Xbox.
AMD is continuously improving and revising their tech. For RDNA2,
Custom
their
made
goals
for
were,
Xbox
roughly
and
speaking,
PlayStation.
to reduce power consumption by re-architecting the GPU to put data close to where it's needed, to
Żona mi się
optimize
zepsuła,
the GPU
przepraszam.
for performance, and to add a new, more advanced feature set. But that feature set is malleable, which is to say that we have our own needs for PlayStation, and that can factor into
Musiałem sobie
what
tilta
AMD's
odpalić w fotelu, bo mi się tak spać
becomes.
zachciało, że
Collaboration
zacząłem
is
się
born.
bujać.
If we bring concepts to AMD that are felt to be widely useful, then they can be adopted into RDNA2 and used broadly, including in PC GPUs. If the ideas are sufficiently specific to what we're trying to accomplish, like the GPU
Dobra
tax
sugestia,
levers
gdyby
I was
właśnie
talking
nowe
about,
PlayStation 5
then
było
they
jak,
end up
jak to
being
Tesla
just
pick-up, taka
for us.
kwadratowa totalnie,
If you
jeszcze z
see
blachy
a
zrobionej.
similar discrete
Wcale by się
GPU
nie grzało.
available as a PC card at roughly the same time
No nie,
as
bo
we
by była
release our
gigantycznym
console,
klocem.
that means
Tak,
our
śmiech z
collaboration with
puszki byłby
AMD
tutaj idealny.
succeeded. In producing technology
Tak.
useful in both worlds. It doesn't mean that we as Sony simply incorporated the PC part into our console. This continuous improvement in AMD technology means it's dangerous to rely on teraflops as an absolute indicator of performance, and CU count should be avoided as well. In the case of CPUs, we all understand this. The PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 each have 8 CPUs, but we never think that meant the capabilities and performance are equal. It's the same for CUs. For one thing, they've been getting much larger over time. Adding new features means adding lots of transistors. In fact, the transistor count for a PlayStation 5 CU is 62% larger than the transistor count for a PlayStation 4 CU. Second, the PlayStation 5 GPU is
Czekaj,
backwards compatible
62%
with PlayStation
powiedział?
4. What does that mean? One way you
PS4.
can achieve backwards compatibility is to put the previous console's chipset in the new console, like we did with some PlayStation 3s. But that's, of course, extremely expensive.
Miał
A better
18
way is
compute
to
units.
incorporate any differences in the previous console's logic into the new console's custom chips. Meaning
30
that
CU ma
even as
mieć?
the technology evolves, the logic and feature set that PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4
to
Pro
było
titles
słabo.
rely on
Dobra,
is
dowiedzieliśmy
still
się w końcu,
available in backwards compatibility modes.
że będzie
One
wsteczna
advantage of this
kompatybilność z
strategy is
PlayStation
that
4.
once backwards compatibility is in the console, it's in.
PlayStation 4 Pro.
Not as if a cost down will remove backwards compatibility like it did on PlayStation 3. Achieving this unification of functionality took years of efforts by AMD, as any roadmap advancement
Agnieszka, to nie
creates a
są ludzie, są
potential
manekiny, jak
divergence
Kevin
in
sam w domu.
logic. Running
Oni
PS4
tam
and
sterują
PS4
pustymi,
titles
za
at
sznurki
boosted
pociąga koleś
frequencies is
i
also
oni
added
tam
complexity.
tak bujają się,
The
leją
boost
jak
is
ten...
truly massive this time around, and some game code just can't handle it. Testing has to be done on a title-by-title basis. Results are excellent, though. We recently took a look at the top 100 PlayStation 4 titles as ranked by playtime, and we're expecting almost all of them to be playable at launch.
Okej,
on
on
PlayStation.
najpewniej porównał, wracając do tych compute
With
units, on
regards to
porównuje
new
pewnie z
features, as I
PlayStation
said,
4
our
Pro,
strategy
tylko
was
zapomniał
to
je
try to
dodać.
break new ground,
Więc będzie
but at the same time
58
not to require use of the new GPU
compute
capability.
units.
For more than a
Będzie
decade,
więcej niż w
GPUs
Xboxie,
have
o
imposed
6.
a restriction on gaming.
Jeżeli to się potwierdzi.
Software handles vertex processing, but for the most part, dedicated hardware is responsible for the triangles and other geometry that the vertices form. That means
Dajcie już
it's not
spokój
possible
człowiekowi
to
myli się.
execute basic optimizations,
nowej
such
generacji
as
konsol.
Bo
aborting
jednak nie
processing of the
dajcie mu
vertex
spokoju.
if all geometry that uses it is off-screen. PlayStation 5 has a new unit called the Geometry Engine, which brings handling of triangles and other primitives under full
Który
program.
trójkąty i inne
As a
prymitywy
game developer, you're
no.
free to
W końcu
ignore its
będziemy mogli się
existence and use the
zjednoczyć, Pawle.
PlayStation 5 GPU as if it were no more capable
Hurra!
than the PS4 GPU.
Komunizm
Or you can
zjednoczy
use
się
this
z
new intelligence
tym drugim.
Simple usage could
Trójkąty.
be performance optimizations,
Tak.
such as removing
Prymitywy świata
backfaced or
łączcie się
off-screen
dzięki
vertices and triangles.
PlayStation.
More complex usage involves something called
Prymitywne shadery
primitive
mamy,
shaders, which
takie
allow the game to
prymitywne
synthesize
działanie.
geometry on the fly as it's being rendered. It's a brand new capability. Using primitive shaders on PlayStation 5 will allow for a broad variety of techniques, including smoothly varying level of detail, addition of procedural detail to close-up objects, and improvements to particle effects and other visual special effects. Another major new feature of our custom RDNA 2-based GPU is ray
Cześć,
tracing,
Konradzie.
using the same strategy as AMD's
Wcale
upcoming
nie śmiejemy
PC
się tutaj z
GPUs.
prezentacji.
The CUs contain
No.
a new specialized unit called the intersection engine,
Super jest.
which can calculate the intersection of
Się bawię
rays,
przednio.
boxes, and triangles. To use the intersection engine, first you build what is called an acceleration structure. It's data in RAM that contains all of your geometry. There's a specific set of formats you can use. They're variations on the same BVH concept. Then, in your shader program, you use a new instruction that asks the intersection engine to check a ray against the BVH. While the intersection engine is processing the requested ray triangle or ray box intersections, the shaders are free to do other work. Having said that,
To jest bardzo
the ray tracing
zaawansowany
instruction
PowerPoint.
is pretty memory intensive, so
Algorytm został
it's a good mix
nagrodę Nobla
with
za
logic
prezentację w
heavy code.
PowerPoincie.
There's of course no
Tak.
need to use ray tracing. PS4 graphics engines will run just fine
Poza
on
tym
PlayStation 5.
przypominam,
But it presents an opportunity for those
jakby
interested.
nikt tego nie przewidział
I'm
wczoraj.
thinking it'll take less than 1 million rays a second to have a big
Tak.
impact on audio. That should be enough for
Znaczy,
audio occlusion
to wszystko
and some
wskazuje na to,
reverse
że
calculations.
w
With a
zasadzie
bit
naprawdę
more of
prawie
the
nikt tego nie
GPU
przewidział.
invested in ray tracing, it should be possible
Tak,
to
no
do
poza
some
nami.
very nice
Opisy
global
tam, że dzisiaj
illumination.
zaprezentują PlayStation 5,
Having
dzisiaj
said that,
prezentacja
adding
PlayStation
ray
5,
tracing
Ray-traced
wreszcie premiera
shadows and
PlayStation
reflections to a
5.
traditional graphics engine could easily take
Tak,
hundreds
żeby
of
nie być w
millions
ogóle
of rays a
gołosłownym.
second, and full ray tracing could take billions. How far can we go?
Wcale nie
I'm
pisaliśmy
starting
o
to
tym
get
wczoraj.
quite bullish. I've already seen a PlayStation 5 title that's successfully using ray tracing based reflections in complex animated scenes with only
O,
modest
pojawiły
costs.
się jednocześnie
Another set of issues for the GPU involved size and frequency. how big do we make the GPU and what frequency?
Pojawiła się chyba jednocześnie jakiś tweet
This is a
albo
balancing
wyszła
act. The chip has a
notka
cost, and
odnośnie
there's a
pełnej
cost for whatever
specyfikacji.
we use to supply that chip
I powiem
with
szczerze,
power and
PlayStation
cooling.
5 wygląda
to jest
źle w
In
porównaniu
general,
do...
I like
Performance jest
running
bardzo
the GPU
rozmazany i
at higher
niewyraźny.
frequency. Let me show you why.
O nie,
Here's two possible configurations for a GPU roughly of the level of the
Mówiłem, że
PlayStation 4 Pro.
36.
This is a thought experiment. Don't take these
Nie
configurations too
bierzcie tej
seriously.
konfiguracji too serious.
If you just
Tak sobie
calculate
wysłaliśmy sobie liczbę
teraflops, you get
stupy.
the same number. But actually, the performance is noticeably different because teraflops is defined as the computational capability
Ludzie,
of the
zostawcie
vector
teraflopsy.
ALU.
Ta wartość nie ma
That's
żadnego
just one
znaczenia.
part of the GPU. There are a lot of other units. And those other units all run faster when the GPU frequency is higher. At 33% higher frequency, rasterization goes 33% faster. Processing the command buffer goes that much faster. The L2 and other caches have that much higher
Pozdrawiam
bandwidth,
moją
and so
nauczycielkę
on.
matematyki
About the only
gimnazjum,
downside is
też
that system
podobne
memory is 33%
zapał
further
do
away in
nauki.
terms of cycles. But the large number of benefits more than counterbalance that. As a friend of mine says, a rising tide lifts all boats. Also, it's easier to fully use 36 CUs in parallel than it is to fully use 48 CUs. When triangles are small, it's much harder to fill all those CUs with useful work. So there's a lot to be said for faster, assuming you can handle the resulting power and heat issues, which frankly we haven't always done the best job at. Part of the reason for that is
Zdecydowanie długo myśleli nad tym, jak wytłumaczyć to, że mniej compute units to lepiej compute units. Długo nad tym myśleli, muszę przyznać.
and how much heat
Czekaj,
will
nie
be
rozumiem teraz
produced
tej
as a result
wykresu
inside
zupełnie.
of the console. Power consumption varies a lot from game to game. When I play
okay,
God of
dobra,
War
już
on my
rozumiem.
PS4 Pro, I know the power consumption is high just by the fan noise.
Granie w
But
wyścigi
power isn't simply
pobiera
about
mniej
engine
prądu
quality.
niż
It's about the
jak umierasz
minutia of
zarażony
what's being
koronawirusem i w ogóle
displayed
nie
and
grasz.
how. It's counterintuitive, but processing dense geometry typically consumes less power than processing simple geometry, which is, I suspect, why Horizon's map screen, with its low triangle count,
To jest nic
makes my
w porównaniu do
PS4
rąbania
Pro
drewna.
heat up so much.
To pożera energii. To pożera tyle energii.
Guess what the maximum power consumption during the entire console lifetime might be, which is to say, the worst case scene in the worst case game, and prepare a cooling solution that we think will be quiet at that power level. If we get it right, fan noise is minimal. If we get it wrong, the console will be quite loud for the higher power games, and there's even a
Dlaczego
chance
czas
that it might
pokazują
overheat
to
and
wszystko na
shut down
przykładzie
if we
obrazka z PlayStation
misestimate
4, bo nie
power
mają
too
obrazka z
badly.
PlayStation 5.
PlayStation 5 is especially
Nawet nie
challenging
mają
because the
obrazu
CPU
projektowanej.
supports 256-bit native instructions that consume a lot of power. These are great here and there, but presumably only minimally used. Or are they? If we plan for major 256-bit instruction usage, we need to set the CPU clock substantially lower or noticeably increase the size of the power supply
Small
and
people.
fan. So, after much discussion,
Small
we decided
PP.
to go with a very different direction on PlayStation 5. We built a GPU with 36 CUs. Mind you, RDNA 2 CUs are large. Each has 62% more transistors than the CUs we were using on PlayStation 4. So, if we compare transistor counts,
Takie są małe,
36
takie.
RDNA 2 CUs equates to roughly 58 PlayStation 4 CUs. It is a fairly sizable GPU. Then we went with a variable frequency strategy for PlayStation 5, which is to say we continuously run the GPU and CPU in boost mode. We supply a generous amount of electrical power and then increase the
twój procesor
frequency
działa
of
stale w
GPU and
trybie
CPU
boost, to
until
twój
they reach
procesor
the
nie ma trybu
capabilities
boost.
of the system's cooling solution.
Tak.
It's a completely
Po prostu
different
pracuje z
paradigm.
wyższą
Rather
częstotliwością.
than running at
Boost,
constant
zawsze jest
frequency and
włączony.
letting power vary based on the
Tak, to nie
workload,
zawsze.
we run at essentially constant power and let the frequency vary based on the workload. We then tackled the engineering challenge of a cost-effective and high-performance cooling solution designed for that specific power level. In some ways, it becomes a simpler problem because there are no more unknowns. There's no need to guess what power consumption the worst-case game might have. As for the details of the cooling solution, we're saving
Tak,
them for
zawsze
our teardown.
gra
I
pożera
think you'll be
najwięcej
quite
prądu, ile się
happy
da.
with what the engineering team came up with. So, how fast can we run the GPU and CPU with this strategy? The simplest approach would be to look at the actual temperature of the silicon die and throttle the frequency on that basis. But that won't work. It fails to create a consistent PlayStation 5 experience.
Czekaj,
It
czekaj,
wouldn't
czekaj.
do to run a console slower simply because it was in a hot
Czy
room.
Nvidia nie
So, rather than
udowodniła
look at the
jakieś
actual temperature of
6
the
czy
silicon
7 lat
die,
temu,
we look
że
at the
częstotliwość
activities that the
wcale nie równa się
GPU and
lepszej
CPU are
wydajności?
performing,
A oni
and set
teraz
the
tutaj mówią,
frequencies
że
on
tak,
that
tak,
basis,
większa
which makes
częstotliwość to
everything
super, będzie lepiej
deterministic
działać.
and repeatable.
Tak, just
While
saying,
we're at it,
just
we also
saying.
use AMD's Smart Shift technology and send any unused power from the CPU to the GPU so it can
Dla ludzi
squeeze
z
out
marketingu
a few
liczą się
more
przede wszystkim
pixels.
cyferki.
The benefits of this strategy are
Tak, tak,
quite
no to
large.
jest na pewno.
Running a GPU at 2 gigahertz was looking like an unreachable target with the old fixed frequency strategy. With this new paradigm, we're able to run way over that. In fact, we have to cap the GPU frequency at 2.23 gigahertz so that we can guarantee that the on-chip logic
Jeszcze
operates
megaherców
properly.
szybciej.
36 CUs at
teraflopsów.
2.23 gigahertz is 10.3 teraflops, and we expect the GPU to spend most of its time at
Czyli
or close to
20%
that frequency
mniej niż
and
Xbox.
performance. Similarly, running the CPU at 3
Co?
gigahertz
Jeszcze raz
was
nie
causing
usłyszałem cię.
headaches with the old strategy. But now we can run it as high as 3.
No już będzie krzyk
In
wielki,
fact,
nie?
it spends most of its
20,
time
całe
at
20.
that frequency. That doesn't mean all games will be running at 2.23 gigahertz and 3.5 gigahertz. When that worst case game arrives, it will run at a lower clock speed, but not too much lower.
Not
To
too
reduce
much
power
lower,
by
not too
10%,
much.
it only takes a couple of percent reduction in frequency, so I'd expect any downclocking to be pretty minor. All things considered, the change to a variable frequency approach will show significant gains for PlayStation gamers. The final of our 3 principles was about
Teraz
finding
będzie
new
najciekawsze.
dreams. It's important for us on the
Tak,
hardware
znajdujemy
team to
nowe
find
sny,
new
marzenia,
ways to
tłumaczcie jak
expand
chcecie.
or deepen gaming,
Pierdololo.
and that's what led us to a focus on 3D audio. As players, we experience the game through the visuals,
3D
through audio, and
audio.
through the feedback we receive from the
Sound
controller,
Blastera
such as
instalują
rumble
pierwszego od
or haptics.
miliona lat.
Personally, I feel a game is just dead without audio. Visuals are, of course, important,
Dolby
but the
Atmos
impact of
albo
audio
hard.
is huge as well. At the same time, the audio team on a game project has to do a lot with a little. For example, on PlayStation 4, there's fierce competition for the Jaguar CPU cores. Audio typically ends up getting just a fraction of a core. That's not much of a computational resource, particularly when you consider that the visuals run at 30 or 60 frames a second, but audio processing needs to happen at almost 200 times a second.
Procesy audio 200
So,
razy na
it's been
sekundę
tough
muszą
going making
trwać.
forward progress on audio with PlayStation 4, particularly when PlayStation 3 was such a beast when it came to audio. The SPUs in Cell were almost a perfect device for audio rendering. Simple pipelined algorithms could really take
procesor
advantage
Cell
of
był tutaj
asynchronous
wyłącznie dobry do
DMA
jednego celu,
and
tworzenia
frequently reached
deweloperów.
100% utilization of the floating point
Musieli
unit.
nauczyć
Tak.
się
There's
programować
unfortunately
wielowątkowo.
nothing comparable on PlayStation 4. Probably the most dramatic
PlayStation
progress of the
VR.
PlayStation 4 generation has been with virtual reality.
O,
The PSVR hardware has its own audio unit. It
oczywiście
supports
pierwszy
about
PSVR.
50 pretty decent
No.
3D sound sources. And this provided a hint as to where we
Jeżeli
could
wyjdzie
go with
drugi
audio,
PSVR
as well
teraz, to
as some
skończy tak jak
valuable
drugi Kinect.
experience. Not to oversimplify, but here were our goals for audio on PlayStation 5. The first goal was great audio for everyone, not just VR users or soundbar owners or headphone users. That meant audio had to
Naszym
be part of
celem
the
jest
console.
tworzenie
It
dobrego
couldn't
dźwięku
be
dla
a
wszystkich.
peripheral. The second goal was
Tak.
to support hundreds of sound sources.
Znowu
We didn't want
komunistyczne
developers
hasła.
to
Co
have
to ma
to
być w
pick and
ogóle?
choose what
źródeł
sounds
dźwięku.
would get
Czemu
3D
setki? Czemu nie
effects
tysiące?
and which wouldn't. We wanted every sound
That's
in the
some
game to
rookie
have
Właśnie,
number.
miliony.
functionality. And finally, we wanted to really take on the challenges of presence
O, coś co
and
na
locality.
PC-tach
Now, when we
umiesz
say
Counter-Strike.
presence, we mean the feeling that you're actually there. You've entered the matrix. It's not, of course, something
Przypominamy,
we thought we could
Counter-Strike
perfectly
już ma
achieve.
Będziemy
The
dekadę na
idea
karku.
was that if we
Tylko
stopped
założymy
using just a
słuchawki
rain
PlayStation
sound
5.
and instead used lots of 3D audio sources for raindrops hitting the ground at all sorts of
Albo
locations
Matrix cię
around you,
wywali.
then at some point your brain would take a leap and you'd begin to have this feeling.
Twój
This
mózg
feeling
wykona
of real
krok
presence
i
inside the
przejdziesz do
virtual world
wirtualnego
of the game.
światu.
This has the capacity to affect your appreciation of the game, just like music in a game does. The concept of locality is simpler. It's just your sense of where the audio is coming from. To the right of you, behind you, above you. This can immerse you further in the game, and it can also directly enhance the gameplay. To use Dead Space as an example, I know, old school. You're fighting enemies in fairly dark, spooky
Ten koleś w ogóle nie
locations.
popija niczym?
Back in the day,
Tak
if you played the
już
game using the
45
TV
minut o suchym
speakers,
pysku?
you could tell that there was one last enemy growling
Może to
and
jest jeden z tych
down,
nowych
but it was
robotów,
difficult
Sony.
to tell quite where that
Reptilianie
enemy
to są.
was. With headphones, you could tell that the enemy was somewhere on the right, which
Chociaż w
let
sumie
you
wiesz, on ma
deduce, if
taki
you couldn't
miękki
see it,
głos,
that it must
że
be
on mu
somewhere
łagodzi
behind
gardło, a nie je
the
zdziera.
TUI.
Więc on im więcej mówi,
But
tym
with
lepiej się
3D
czuje.
audio with good locality, the idea is you know the enemy is precisely there, and you
There.
turn and you take it out. So, how do we know where a sound is coming from in the first place?
Pierwsza emocja, jaką
all those
usłyszeliśmy
bumps
od
and folds
ilu
in the
minut?
ear have a meaning, evolutionarily
44.
based on what direction the sound is coming from. Sound waves bounce around inside the ear. There's some constructive and destructive interference, and the result is a change in volume.
Do wszystkich, którzy pisali o tym, że to lekcja historii, to teraz przeszliśmy do biologii.
These volume changes and phase shifts are different for each direction and also vary depending on the frequency of the sound. Head size and head shape also impact the sound in a similar fashion. The way that the sound changes
tak właśnie
based on
słyszymy. Mamy teraz
direction
piękny
and
wykres.
frequency
Jak
can be encoded in a
zastanawiacie się,
table
jak
called the
słyszymy, to teraz
head-related
widzicie,
transfer
jak słyszymy.
function, or
Na czerwono, trochę na
HRTF.
zielono, ale tak
Here's
zielono
part
tylko
of
u
it.
góry.
The vertical axis is
Na
the
dole
frequency.
bardziej na czerwono
The
słyszymy.
horizontal
Tam nawet-
axis is the direction.
Tam nawet na
right,
niebiesko
and
jest
the
na
color
górze,
gives the
zobaczcie.
degree of
Więc
attenuation
jak
of the
chcecie
sound
kiedyś
at that
usłyszeć, nie
frequency.
wiem, niebo,
Nie,
to
to
raczej nie. Bardziej ogień
HRTF is
słyszymy.
as
Trawę
unique to
trochę
an
słychać.
individual as a fingerprint is. In fact, you're looking at mine right now.
To zobacz między
Here's
ogniem
how
jednym
we
a drugim
measure
trochę
an
trawy się
HRTF.
weszło.
We've taken hundreds of people through this process. We put a microphone in the
Myślałem, że to
subject's
rolki papieru
left and right
toaletowego.
ear canals, and then sit the subject down in the middle of an array of 22 speakers. We then play
Niesamowite
an
jest to, że w
audio
tym momencie
sweep
słucha tego
from each
gadania
speaker
630
as we
000
rotate
ludzi.
the subject. In the course of 10 or 20 minutes,
Niesamowite.
we're able to sample the HRTF at over 1,000
Ten
locations.
człowiek,
Using an HRTF
O,
when rendering
o,
audio
akumulator
creates
w
a
samochodach
paralleled quality, but it's computationally expensive. The
wiesz jak
simplest way to
Sony
use
to
an
Japonia,
HRTF
Japonia
is
to
to
Honda
process the
Civic
sound
akumulator
source to
nowy
make it appear
dostaniesz,
as if
Bart.
it's coming from one of
Tak
those
jest.
1,000 locations we sample. Unfortunately, the processing has to be done in frequency domain rather than time domain, so there's multiple fast Fourier transforms needed for every sound source for every audio tick. That's a lot of multiplies. This computational complexity was the determining factor for our strategy. It meant we had to bite the bullet and design and build a custom hardware unit for 3D audio. Collectively, we're referring to the hardware unit and the proprietary algorithms we run on it
robimy ze
as
swoim życiem?
Tempest 3D Audio Tech. The
Próbujemy,
meaning of 3D audio
jesteśmy
and
klaunami,
technology should
siedzimy
be
i
pretty
próbujemy
obvious
dać
here.
ludziom rozrywkę,
As for
którzy nas
Tempest,
oglądają.
I feel it really reflects
Więc
our goals with audio.
dajmy im
It
rozrywkę.
suggests a certain
Bo ten pan
intensity of
zdecydowanie
experience
nie
and also
umie.
hints at your presence within it. We're calling the hardware unit that we built the Tempest.
W ogóle, ile on
It's
teraz
based on
gadał o tym
AMD's
audio?
GPU
10 minut?
technology.
Jakieś?
We
Nie no,
modified
z
it
6
for
minut,
GPU
6-7 minut.
in such a way
Mogliby to
as to make
zawrzeć
it very
w
close
jednym
to the
zdaniu
SPUs
dosłownie.
in PlayStation 3. Remember when I said that they were ideal for
Od teraz
audio?
będzie
So, the
dedykowana
Tempest
karta
engine has
dźwiękowa
no
do
caches,
każdego
just like the
PlayStation.
SPU.
Już nie
All
będzie
data
procesor
access
tego
is via
robił. Będzie to
DNA,
robiła
just like
dedykowana
the
karta
SPU.
dźwiękowa jak na
Our
PC-tach od
target
20
that
lat.
we have more
Ponad.
power than a CPU,
No,
thanks to
pierwszy
the
Sound Blaster
parallel
Live kiedy
technology
wyszedł?
we
Moda
can
na karty
achieve,
dźwiękowe.
and that it would be more efficient than our GPU thanks to the SPU-like
Który mamy rok?
architecture. The goal
A,
being
2020,
possible
no tak.
near 100% utilization of the CU's
To
vector
czekaj,
units.
czekaj. No,
Where we
tak
ended
możliwe.
up is a
Nie, no
unit with
98,
roughly the
6
same
chyba tam
SIMD
były już.
power and
Takie
bandwidth as
oczywiście
all
ten.
the Jaguar
Zaraz powie, że ten
cores in the
akcelerator
PlayStation
DW
4
będzie.
combined. If we were to use the same algorithms as PSVR, that's
Tak.
enough for something like 5,000 sound sources.
O,
But of
pan
course,
powiedział,
we
że
want to
setki,
use more complex
sound
algorithms,
sources, a
and
teraz
we don't
powiedział, że
need
PlayStation VR
anything
będzie
like
5000.
that number of sounds.
To na tamtym slajdzie
Super.
było
It would have been
1000.
wonderful
A
if a
ISO
simpler
jest
strategy,
double
such as
hundreds.
using Dolby Atmos peripherals, could have achieved our goals.
Aga
but we wanted
poprosiła o
3D
żart,
audio
dostarcz,
for all,
bo ja nie
not
mam
just those
pomysłu.
with licensed soundbars or the like.
Agnieszka,
Also, we wanted many
jeżeli
hundreds of
oglądasz
sound sources,
48
not just the
minut, to
32
patrzysz
that
na żart
Atmos
od
supports.
48 minut.
And finally, we wanted to be able to throw an overwhelming amount of processing power at the problem, and it wasn't clear what any peripheral might have inside of it. In fact, with the Tempest engine,
Natomiast mam tylko takie
we
żarty, za
even
które
got
można
enough
dostać bana na
power that we
Facebooku.
can allocate some to the games, to the extent that games
Może
want
się
to
tłum
make use
podział,
of
ty.
convolution reverb and
Że
other
przestałeś
algorithms that are
pilnować
either
tłumu.
Chcecie się
computationally
rozchodzić,
expensive
chłopaki.
or need high bandwidth. But the primary purpose of the
Jak
Tempest
się coś
engine
ciekawego pojawi,
remains
to weź ich tam
3D
zaprać
audio.
z powrotem.
Now, 3D audio is a major academic research topic. It's safe to say that no one in the world has all of the answers.
Nikt na świecie
And the
nie ma
set of
wszystkich
algorithms
odpowiedzi.
that has to be invented, tuned, or implemented to realize our vision for 3D audio is immense. For example, use of HRTFs in games is quite complex. Before, I talked about making a sound source appear as if it's coming from one of those 1,000 HRTF sample locations. But for high-quality 3D game audio, we have to handle other possibilities. The sound source might not be at one of the 1,000 HRTF sample locations, so we have to blend
Super, więcej
the
diagramów.
HRTF
Tego
data from the
potrzebowaliśmy.
closest locations that we have sampled. The sound source might be moving, which
Już
needs
tyle diagramów,
very
że im
special
się
handling as that blend
prezentacja
keeps
przycina.
changing, and that can cause phase artifacts in the resulting audio. Or the sound source might have a size to it, meaning it should feel as if it's coming from an area rather than a single point. There's also whole categories of approaches to be handled. 3D audio can be implemented using individual processing of 3D sound sources, but alternatively,
Lucyna.
ambisonics can be used for 3D audio.
Pokaż ludziom coś
Ambisonics
ciekawego.
speak somewhat like
Chodź.
the spherical harmonics used
Nie.
in computer graphics.
Nie chcę.
And
Nie
finally,
chcę zejść z
there's
szafy.
audio devices. The player might be using headphones or TV speakers or have a higher-end surround sound setup with 6 or more speakers, all of which need different approaches. That's a lot of variations. It's nice to have the computational resources of the Tempest engine, but it's clear that achieving our ultimate goals with 3D audio is going to be a multi-year, step-by-step process. Having said that, headphone audio implementation is largely complete
O,
at
teraz
this
będzie
time.
wymieniał typy
It was a
urządzeń
natural place
audio.
for us to start. With headphones, we control exactly what each ear hears,
Super.
and therefore the algorithmic development and implementation are more straightforward. For TV speakers and stereo speakers, we're in the process of implementing virtual surround sound. The idea being that if you're sitting in a sweet spot in front of the TV, then the sound can be made to feel as if it's coming from any direction, even behind you. Virtual surround sound has a lot in common with 3D audio on headphones, but it's more complex because the left ear can hear the right speaker and vice versa. We have a basic implementation of virtual surround sound up and running. We're now looking at increasing the size of that sweet spot, which is to say,
Zero radości,
making
żarty
the
nie
area
ma,
you
kota
need
nie
to
ma.
be
No
in to feel
niestety.
the 3D effect larger, and we're also working to boost the sense of locality.
Taki artykuł pójdzie na Gramagedon. Kota nie ma, zero
We're going to
radości.
see what we can do to bring virtual surround sound to a similar level, after which we'll start in on setups with more speakers, such as 6-channel surround sound. It's now to the point where some of the PlayStation 5
Zwykłe
games in
audio?
development
Nie,
are
to jest
extensively using
słocie
these
audio.
systems. One of the game demos allows you to toggle
Tam
between conventional
dodadzą.
PlayStation 4 style
To jest audio
stereo
lepsze niż
audio
zwyczajne?
and our new 3D audio. I listened with just an
Czwartą
ordinary
jest
pair
też.
of over-the-ear headphones and wow,
Znaczy wiesz, te
I
parabole,
could
co
feel a
się
difference.
pojawiają, to sugerują, że
3D
może
audio has
być.
that dimensional
Coś
feel to
może
it.
iść na rzecz.
Conventional stereo audio feels smashed flat by comparison. The improvement is obvious. So, a big advancement, but have I entered the matrix? Does my brain believe I'm really there? Like I was talking about earlier when I explained our target of presence. Well, the answer is no, but you've probably caught on to what's missing here, namely whose HRTF was being used. It
Więcej
wasn't
trawy,
mine.
zobacz.
It was the default HRTF.
czarny
The audio
słyszy
team
inaczej.
analyzed the hundreds that they measured and chose the one they felt
Bo
was the
domyślnie
closest
słyszy
fit
się
to the
tak,
total
ten
game
czerwony
playing
idzie
audience.
trochę w dół, a u czarnego
This
tak
shows
idzie
a
równo.
piece of the default HRTF on the left and my HRTF on
Niesamowite.
the right. You can see that the general features are much the same, but the details are quite different. With the default HRTF, as I said,
Już
the
jest
3D audio
22
sounds
tysiące
pretty
lajki w
great.
łapki w
When I
dół.
use my HRTF,
Było
though,
9
the
tysięcy na
audio
początku
reaches
tej
a
prezentacji.
higher
Czy
level
tam
of realism,
było znacznie
which is to
mniej.
say
Jak się
that
zaczęła,
when
było
using
9
headphones
tysięcy, a
and
teraz
my
już jest
HRTF,
22 tysiące w dół.
I occasionally get fooled and even think a sound is coming from the real world when it's actually coming from the game.
Tak będzie na YouTubie zapis streamu.
Sufficiently far
Nagrywasz
from the
to?
default
Powiedz, że
HRTF.
nagrywasz.
That's
Dobrze.
the red
Ale
dot here, that they can
powiedział,
toggle
że,
between
dziwi
PS4
mi
style and
wrażenie,
PS5
że
style audio
dźwięk pochodzi z
and not
prawdziwego
sense
świata,
much
a nie z
difference.
gry.
I've had a few people
Ale
describe the PlayStation 5's
technicznie
3D audio as sounding
dźwięk z
like
gry
a bit better
pochodzi z
stereo
prawdziwego
audio.
świata, bo
Presumably
jest
they're the
generowany
ones
przez
at the very
głośnik
edges
w
of this
prawdziwym
diagram.
świecie.
Which means what HRTF you're using is key. I'd like everyone to be able to experience what I'm
Teoria
experiencing,
obalona.
but obviously it's not possible to measure the HRTF of every PlayStation user. That means HRTF selection and synthesis are going to be big topics going forward as the Tempest technology matures.
Aha, czyli tylko
At PlayStation
wybrańcy
5 launch,
słyszą
we'll
to,
be
że
offering a choice
PlayStation
of
jest taki
5
fajny dźwięk.
HRTFs. There's
Tylko
a
wybrańcy będą
simple
to słyszeć.
test where you pick the one
Nie
that gives
każdy.
you the best locality.
Ja słyszę,
That's
ale wy
just
nie.
the first step, though. This is an open-ended research
Tylko w
topic.
naszych głowach.
Maybe you'll be sending us a photo of your ear, and we'll choose a neural network to pick the closest HRTF in our library.
Organizm
Maybe you'll be
przekształca
sending us
dźwięk.
a video of your ears and your head, and we'll make a 3D model of them and synthesize the HRTF. Maybe you'll play an audio game to tune your HRTF. We'll be subtly changing it as you play and home in on the HRTF that gives you the highest score, meaning that it matches you the best. This is a journey we'll all be taking together over the next few years. Ultimately, we're committing to enabling everyone to experience that next level.
Uwierz mi, Krzysztofie, robimy co możemy.
Hopefully,
Ale
I've
po
been able to illustrate a bit about our
54
design and
minutach-
decision-making process today, and why PlayStation 5 has the feature set that it does. Now comes the fun part.
Now
You
comes
get to
the
see
fun
how
part.
the development
W końcu.
community takes advantage of that feature set. I'm hoping for the completely unexpected. Will it come from audio, ray tracing, the capabilities of the SSD, or something else? I guess we'll find out soon enough.
A teraz fajna rzecz. Dowiemy się
Thank you
niedługo.
for your time today.
Ja pier... And now the fun part. Koniec.
Teraz najzabawniejsza, najlepsza część przedstawienia. Do widzenia państwu! O matko, ty naprawdę skończyli.
Zawsze chciałem.
O, co masz do powiedzenia? Tak może poważniej trochę.
Odkryj nowy smak Doritos.
Teraz.
Jestem. Zaraz
Jesteś?
ci do powiedzenia.
Odkryj kształt, który trzęsie się.
Świetli.
Zostańcie jeszcze chwilę, coś będziemy komentować. No fajnie, że chrupki reklamujesz. Tak. Powiem tak, marketingowo Sony, nie wiem co się stało, ale no, 8 lat temu to widzieliśmy po prostu festiwal miazgi w wykonaniu Sony, który rozumiał graczy, mówił, robił wszystko tak, jak powinien robić, zaskakiwał, był zabawny, a teraz zobaczyliśmy po prostu abominację i wow. Brak mi słów po prostu. Myślałem, że naprawdę ktoś z Sony pomyśli, ej, wiecie co, pokażmy chociaż jakiś projekt, jakiś szkic, jakiś coś. No, Xbox leci w najlepsze, tak, zgarnia w zasadzie wszystko, co się da. A Sony śpi, nic nie wiadomo o nim i tak dalej. No to podali nam specyfikacje i masę po prostu bzdur, których nikomu totalnie nie zależało.
Najciekawszy w całym wystąpieniu był ten Sting, który na początku wyszedł. Oni wszyscy tacy w ogóle zachwyceni byli.
Tak.
Wygląda jakby nie wiem co.
Znaczy oni wyglądali tak jak pamiętasz, jak była prezentacja na tym, na Blizzarda była prezentacja, która była dokładnie taka sama, że wszyscy już wiedzieli o tym Diablo Immortal, tam prezenterzy wychodzili jak na ścięcie i tylko jeden gość był w miarę taki to tutaj ten gość, co gadał, był taki super entuzjastyczny, uśmiechał się, fajnie,
Zwrócę
super,
uwagę na jedną
ale
rzecz,
wiedział
zaraz
doskonale,
pokażę
że...
na ekranie. Tutaj mieliśmy prezentację tej wstecznej kompatybilności, gdzie mieliśmy taką ładną ikonkę z PlayStation 3 i na dole było takie PlayStation 2, że był wsteczna kompatybilność. I potem pojawia się PlayStation 5 i pojawia się PlayStation 4 Pro, PlayStation 4 i niżej wciąż jest miejsce na taką ikonkę, że jeszcze z PlayStation 3 niech będzie kompatybilne albo z czymś. I co? I to się tam nigdy nie pojawia. Nie ma, zniknęło.
Tak, no,
Pokazuje, że
widać, że było na pewno, a jednak nie. Będzie tylko z czwórki, ale to jest do przewidzenia, bo architektura tak naprawdę jest w zasadzie identyczna, więc... No dobra, co? chyba trzeba napisać newsa na Gromagedon. Zapis przerzucimy na YouTube, także na naszym kanale będzie można go sobie obejrzeć. Super, naprawdę polecam, godzina totalnie niczego. Tak, trochę matematyki, trochę PowerPointa się nauczyliśmy, wykresów ładnych, o tym, że dźwięk jest czerwony i zielony, a niebieskiego to nie ma tak naprawdę, ale jest. No co, no Xbox zgarnął wszystko, tak? Nie ma co ukrywać. Teraz Sony będzie musiało naprawdę ciężko. Będą mieli pod górkę. Nie zdziwiłbym się, gdyby naprawdę na dzień dobry Xbox wygrywał wojnę konsol. Będzie albo to będzie powtórka z PlayStation 3 między Xboxem a 360, albo po prostu Xbox wygra. Inaczej tego nie widzę. Dobra, Bart, nie wiem, czy chcesz tam jeszcze coś dorzucić?
Przez 20 sekund musimy o czymś porozmawiać. To będzie równa godzina.
Tak, powiedz coś przez 20 sekund.
Właśnie puściłem prezentację Xboxa i była znacznie ciekawsza.
Tak.
Zobaczyliśmy, jak konsola wygląda wewnątrz, na zewnątrz, jak gry na niej działają, jak wygląda kontroler.
Tak, jak jest skonstruowane, całą architekturę sprzętu, tam
I
ludzie już
opowiadał o
dotykają
tym
to,
gość,
grają na
który
tym.
nie stał jak kołek.
Dokładnie. Okej. Myślę, że to wszystko. Nie ma co przedłużać naszej i widzów agonii. Dzięki, że było nas tyle dzisiaj. Naprawdę było więcej osób niż się spodziewaliśmy. I co?
Do następnego razu.
Może kolejna prezentacja będzie lepsza. Jeżeli będzie w takich godzinach, że będziemy w stanie, to też ją pewnie skomentujemy na żywo.
Stare rosyjskie przysłowie. Następnym razem przyjadę kamazem.
Do swidania.
Gniosja nie łamiecie. Zakończ.
Dobrze.
Tak.
Czy już zakończyłeś?
Gotowe.
Dobra. No dobra, rzuć to na YouTube'a Gromagedonu.